There have been at least 6 members who support the closure motion. I will put the question forthwith without amendments or debate. The question is that, you can sit down, the question is that the question be put. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Is a division called? Ring the bell.
Thank you. Lock the doors. Question is a motion moved by Minister Symes. Those members who are supporting the motion, please stand in your place, and I indicate my vote with the ayes. Thank you, members. Members voting against, please stand in your place. Thank you, members. The result of the division, ayes 19, noes 18, therefore the ayes have it. Question is the motion moved by Mr. Ondaatje be agreed to. Those opinion say aye. Aye. In the contrary, no. Believe noes have it. Division call. Ring the bell for 1 minute, please. Thank you. Lock the doors, please. Members, the question is a motion moved by Mr. Ondaatje. Members supporting the motion, please stand in your place. Thank you. Members voting against the motion, please stand in your place, and I indicate my vote with the noes. Thank you, members. A result of the division, ayes 18, noes 19, therefore the noes have it, and the debate will continue. I will call Mr. Ondaatje.
Thank you very much, President. I rise tonight to speak to the Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment Pandemic Management Bill of 2021. And I want to start by, President, saying that I'm adamantly opposed to this bill. Opposed with every bone in my not unsubstantial sized body. I've always, and always have and always will be, opposed to legislation that is rushed through this place, that's poorly worded and frankly will leave Victorians worse off tomorrow than they are today. Victorians of all political persuasions only want two things from their government: to either help them or to get out of their way. And this government lives by a different motto, claiming to help them while putting every possible hurdle in their way. I really thought this place, specifically those opposite, would be able to come up with a decent bill to bring to this place in the 610 days since the state of emergency was first declared. 610 days. Instead, we get this half-cooked bill with little or no consultation that has red flags on it from start through to finish. And they claim this morning this is urgent. They claim we have to do this quickly after being started this process 610 days ago. And then we get some lame dog ate my homework excuse this morning as to why they have to rush it through. Since the first state of emergency was called, President, we've spent over 262 days here in lockdown, more than anywhere else in the world. And in my electorate, the local areas of places like Hume and Melbourne were locked down even more. Over 1,000 businesses have either gone into liquidation, and many small businesses have shut their doors, moved interstate, some never to reopen. I would invite members to go for a walk down Burke Street to have a look for themselves, but when that's been suggested, it has been rejected by members in this House. Victoria had a net migration loss of 42,000 people. For the first time in a long time, we've gone into the negative. And thousands of people have contacted my office, not just on this bill or others like it, but with issues coping with isolation, dealing with the department that hasn't been responsive, and the need for just a general chat about how they're feeling. Anyone who is in this House that has been in touch with their community would say the Victorians have been through absolute hell. But while every Victorian has done everything they can, it seems this government can't even produce an adequate bill for debate. People have hurt. People are suffering. Mental health, depression, sadly suicide, have grown in this state. People have lost their jobs. Families are hurting, whatever families mean. Singles were kept in bubbles and not able to see people. Students were not able to go to school. And I make the point, President, that little children who started in prep last year during lockdown are in grade 2 next year. Students who made their first transition to year 7 in secondary school, a year they would quite look forward to into gaining a bit more independence in their life, started in year 7, were locked down to homeschooling, spent most of this year doing exactly the same thing, and they are in year 9 next year. People are hurting. It's not just me that's reflected on this bill, others have. And I'll talk about the eminent people in Victoria who have reflected on this bill. But indeed the Ombudsman herself has reflected. But before I talk about what the Ombudsman has said directly, let me remind the House about this. On the 4th of July 2020, about 3,000 residents of 9 inner Melbourne public housing towers were detained by the state. They received no advance notice or explanation of a direction to stay inside their often crowded high-rise homes without outside space. The images of distress amongst those families were beamed right across the world from Melbourne, Australia. Around 11 a.m. on the 4th of July, senior officials dealing with the public health emergency agreed intervention was needed for those towers. They discussed the structure, the need for community engagement, for security and provision of supports for residents. That was 11 a.m. Several officials said they expect the intervention wouldn't occur till midnight the following day, some 36 hours later. But at 4 o'clock that afternoon, 4:08 exactly, the Premier of Victoria announced the lockdown effective immediately. Locked down those high-rise towers with armed police and fences around them. But not a word from government MPs about that. Or the Greens. Most of the residents found out when they saw uniformed police officers surrounding their building. The Deputy Chief Health Officer, who was acting as the CHO on the day, told the Ombudsman that although she signed the directions, the timing was not of her advice. She was given less than 15 minutes to consider the terms of several lengthy documents and their human rights implication. 15 minutes. In the Ombudsman's report into what happened, one of the recommendations said this, recommendation 7. The reasons for imposing a lockdown on the 4th of July 2020, with just a few hours planning, remained unclear to the investigation. Such immediate response was not specifically recommended by the Deputy Cho, who, like other senior DHS officers, originally anticipated the public health intervention commencing after at least 24 hours would have occurred. And I tell you, President, if this bill gets passed, we're going to see more of the same. One person, the Premier of Victoria, making all the decisions to do whatever he wants, to whoever he wants, whenever he wants. We can't accept that. We can't accept that. That happens in countries many of our multicultural communities have fled to come to Melbourne to get away from. And this government and the Greens and Ms Patton are saying this is a good thing to do. Not in modern day Victoria. We should never accept that. Many people have referred to this bill as a power grab, and I think that gives the government far too much credit. The bill is equivalent of cramming in at the very last minute to make a deadline. It's a disgrace because it missed the mark on so many levels, and it's evoked so much emotions in Victorians. And while those opposite shake their head, they fail to comprehend that you've lied to them again and again and again about lockdowns, about reopening, about mandates, and when just about everything else you've done, and finally you've got the audacity to propose this rubbish into our parliament. A power grab that has been described by legal professionals and constitutional lawyers as Stasi-like. This bill gives too much power for any government to wield, not just this one. And I have to say, if we're in government, we shouldn't have these exact powers either. We shouldn't give unfettered control to one single person. That happens in countries across the globe, in some countries, that we abhor. And I know in the last sitting of the Parliament, President, I referred to the Premier as King John Dan. I will not do that today. But I tell you what, these sort of actions reflect some of that thinking. And I'd like to say that should we win government, we will repeal this terrible legislation that's come before the House today, if it does become law. It's a bit hard for those on the government benches to comprehend what this is doing to the people. It provides this government in this state the power to detain citizens, to treat silence as guilt, to prevent people challenging detention in court, and provides no independent oversight. But it's all right. It's all right. We can appeal to a public servant, apparently, and see how that goes. Well, it's not all right. God help us. God help us. I'm sure everyone who wants the legal application looked at Ms Patton, because she's more of an expert, apparently, than the QCs. She's called people naive if they don't support this bill. Well, apparently Ms Patton is more qualified than the eminent QCs who've spoken against this. We know people don't trust this government, and we could talk about that all day, and if the time allowed me, President, I would. But this policy and this bill is fundamentally bad. Forget politics. Forget your views on lockdowns, and forget your views on this Premier. This bill is bad for a Labor government, a Liberal government, or any form of government in this state. It's a bad bill for Victoria. It's as simple as that. And if it was any good, if this bill was any good, where are the government speakers lining up to speak on this today? Well, they're not there. They're not lining up in droves to speak in support. Because I suspect deep down they don't actually like this bill at all. But they're nervous. They're nervous to contradict Chairman Dan, save they lose their parliamentary secretary role or their ministerial role. They don't want to dare conflict with the chairman. This bill's got no sunset clause, which means it can just go on forever. It says it'll have parliamentary security as scrutiny because it'll be looked at by SARC, but we know SARC is going to be stacked with government representatives. Rubbish. And there's no independent scrutiny for detention powers. Now, it's not me that's saying it's bad. It's the legal experts, the people who devote their whole lives and spend every day practising law. Now, I could reel them off, the 60 QCs, the Ombudsman, etc., etc. And the whole basis of this bill today, President, is a bill that the government says, oh, just trust us. Just trust us. We'll be right. This is a government where the Premier said, we don't want to spend 2021 bouncing in and out of lockdowns. Well, he's done that exact thing. His exact thing. The government just want us to trust them, and Victorians don't, and I don't. And when they're asked, when they're held to account in inquiries, they roll out the standard response, I don't recall. I don't know who did it. Somebody must have done it, but we don't know who. Well, to quote a phrase often used in morning radio, I think that's bulltish. And I say to those opposite and the trio of Labor-like ghouls on the crossbench, how dare you support this? How dare you support this? Ms Patton said in her contribution today she wished she had more time to read the emails from her constituents about this. Well, isn't that one of your first priorities, to listen to what your constituents say? Because I can tell you I've had thousands upon thousands upon thousands of emails telling me we should not support this pandemic bill. And do you know, President, how many emails I've had saying we should support the pandemic bill? None. None. Mr Finn has had one. I've had none. But thousands of them. So I say to Ms Patton and Ms Ratnam, if you're truly supportive of your constituents who are the same constituents as mine, you should be listening to them. And they're saying don't vote for this. And those who are against it, for example, Ms Ratnam, her colleague, Mr Reid, the member for Brunswick, in the lower house said this: these powers are a little bit like giving the government a car, but we cannot tell the government exactly how the government exactly is going to drive it. Now, Mr Reid, the Green in the lower house, said he's uncertain about this bill. Yes, Ms Ratnam from the Green has come in today and saying that she will support this bill. She should be listening to her constituents. I've spoken to a lot of people about this. Ms Patton at one stage said in the last fortnight this bill gets the balance right. And now today there's a whole series of amendments. So clearly it was unbalanced. Now, I just want to touch on one thing. I've talked to a lot of people. I spoke to people in the street, in my local shopping centre, by phone, by email, and I spoke to some people out front today. And I want to make this point. I completely abhor and condemn people who make personal threats against members of parliament. Gallows, signs, that sort of thing is totally unacceptable. So don't conflate the fact that there's a small group of people doing this with the greater message from the people out there who are living a peaceful life and just sending a message, who I spoke to today. So I don't support that. And I know because I have been, and my family has been subject to threats. I know this. I know what it's like. But I say to Ms Ratnam, who talked about anybody who supports that shouldn't be in a leadership position, that her federal colleague Adam Bant was at a rally where they burnt an effigy of a former federal minister. So the Greens, if they're saying someone shouldn't be in leadership because they support that personal attack on members of parliament, Mr Bant should resign and Ms Ratnam should condemn that. They should condemn that. So I don't support personal attacks on people. I don't support it. But I say to this, as the Victorian Bar has said today, the amendments for what was apparently a really good bill in the lower house that needs to be substantially amended now falls well short and does not go far enough to protect the rule of law. I stand with my Liberal National colleagues. I stand with most of the sensible crossbenchers here, not the ones who've done a deal since March this year with the government, and bitterly on behalf of my constituents, because I've consulted widely, oppose this bill.
Thank you. Mr Atkinson.
Thank you, Mr President. I don't intend to canvass the same issues that have been raised by many other speakers, but I certainly concur with many of the remarks that have been made, and particularly with some of the presentation that was made by Mr Rich Phillips in this debate, which I think certainly went to some of the key issues. Can I indicate that I'm taking a slightly different view of this legislation to everyone else? And the view that I take is this. I find that it extraordinary that we are looking at pandemic legislation which is supposedly crafted for management of a future pandemic when we haven't analysed the scorecard of how we went in managing this pandemic. Now, the Liberal Party has actually indicated that if it were to win the election next year, that it would hold a Royal Commission into the pandemic. And I think that that is probably a sensible policy to take to the electorate and a sensible initiative. However, to me, to a large extent, a Royal Commission at that point in time would be like looking in the rear vision mirror and then trying to establish what you'd done wrong and certainly put in place recommendations for the future. No doubt also participating in some sort of blame game activities perhaps, albeit the people who are appointed to conduct those Royal Commissions, I think, usually act with great integrity and do great service to our state. What I would wish to see really now is an urgent review of where we are at now. And not just what we are doing in the Victorian government, not just the mistakes that have been made, because I'm not interested in just going back and blaming people and tackling mistakes. I think we should also be cognisant of the things that we've done right, of the good things that happened. And I think that we should be looking not just at what we've done in Victoria, but indeed looking at what the other states have done and what they got right and what they got wrong. And we should be looking at what the federal government's done. And we should be looking at some of the international experience. Because there are so many areas in this pandemic that we really need to understand much, much better, including data interpretation, including the decision-making processes that have led to, which vaccines we were to take and when we were to take them. And what other treatments might have been ruled in or ruled out in terms of combating this virus. It concerns me that there are some 10,000 people reported today in the press that in fact are starting to look at adverse incident claims from the vaccines. Now, in the scheme of things where we have millions of people vaccinated, yes, it's a small number. But those people have suffered, and if you're one of those people who's suffered, it's no compensation that you're one of a few. And the reality is that we do need to understand how we got to that position. I personally am not at all convinced that we should be looking at vaccinating young children under 12 years of age. But we need to look at that process. We need a proper review of it. We need to look at those things that we've done in terms of the lockdowns. You know, one of the key things in terms of this whole process and what the government says in terms of the trust us issue is how do we do that? How can the public have confidence, let alone the members of Parliament, when in fact the very information upon which so many decisions have been made have not been shared with the Parliament, let alone the public? The CHO, and Ms Ratnam referred to what a good CHO we had in her contribution. For me, I don't know whether he is or not, because I can't see the information that substantiates the decisions that he's made and conveyed and implemented. At every step, the government has refused to release that information. And it seems to me that so much of the management of this entire pandemic process has been done as a silo exercise. that it's been focused entirely on the virus but has not considered the ramifications of the measurements, of the measures that have been taken in terms of mental health, in terms of business collapses, and the stress that that has put on so many families. Stress that we haven't even seen flush through the system yet, because people who've lost small businesses are in real danger of losing their houses as well, because that's how they funded their participation in those small businesses. We've seen multicultural communities that are frayed at the edges, that have been put under such pressure. We have lost some of that magic that we had in Victoria in our multicultural communities because of the way we have mismanaged this pandemic in many ways. And that's not to say that there haven't also been some good things done along the way, as I readily concede. Half of the problem is, to me, that this whole exercise has been done by a very small group of people, essentially the Premier. And the CHO, there's no doubt about it, is a working part of the Premier's influence. And a very small group of cabinet ministers. I mean, in terms of the management of this pandemic, not even the whole cabinet was taken into confidence, let alone the backbench, let alone the Parliament, let alone the people of Victoria. And that is outrageous. And it's why there have been mistakes made that might not have been made had there been a greater debate, a greater sharing of information, more hands to the pumps. And now we see this legislation come before us. And it clearly is inadequate in so many respects. Ms Patton and Mr Medic are both transactional politicians. I get why they support the government in this exercise, because essentially it's quid pro quo. We'll support the government, we'll make sure that you get this through as long as you look after our pet projects. I'm a little bit more disappointed in Ms Ratnam, because from my experience the Greens have actually provided greater scrutiny of government over the long haul. And certainly Mr Barber did in the last Parliament. But so too has Ms Ratnam in most cases. And yet she's fallen at this time on this legislation. And I understand the concern that she had about a whole range of people, including the homeless, including refugees, including people who had lost their jobs or were in circumstances where they have been really stressed, really damaged by this process. But mind you, I would suggest that she might extend her thinking to those people who've suffered from mental health issues, to those students that Mr Ondaatje talked about, whose education has been disrupted. I understand the groups that she's been concerned about. But the reality is that this legislation gives them no confidence, gives them no succour. This legislation is as bad for those groups that she highlighted as for anyone else, and in large measure that is because of the failure of scrutiny of this government under this legislation as proposed. When the Ombudsman comes out and talks about it, yes, there is reason for concern. When the legal fraternity and so many organisations that are concerned with human rights and with liberty and with the function of our society, and those who are disadvantaged in our society come out and express concern about the legislation, then surely this government, on its boasts, would be thought to take notice, and yet it is not. To talk about fines of $45,000, I mean, that's a higher penalty than if you went and held up a 7-Eleven with a gun. I mean, it's extraordinarily disproportionate. And yet people on the government benches are prepared to say, oh yeah, that's okay. We're prepared to say it's okay. And, you know, the claim was, well, hey, Liberals, you got what you wanted. The CHO's not making the decision anymore. Now it's the Premier and the Health Minister. Well, as Mr Somerick indicated at the IBAC hearings last week, the Health Minister's only there by virtue of patronage and can be replaced at any point in time if the Premier's not happy. So, in fact, you have a situation where the Premier is the key person in this. And this Premier has not been prepared to share information, to actually engage the community. He dismisses everybody. And they're prepared to run that same distraction that in fact was run in, as we saw in the IBAC hearings of, oh, well, if we get criticism of what we're doing, just play the racist card. Well, here, if we get criticism of what we're doing, play the right-wing card. You know, this is a nonsense. We are all in this together as Victorians. And at the moment, there is no trust and confidence in this legislation. And there is no reason for it to be rushed through. And in fact, the very process that's brought us to this debate today is part of a truncated process that has avoided scrutiny, that has avoided consultation, even with the backbench. This is a product of backroom deals, and we all know that backroom deals do not deliver good government. We all know that there is a penalty to be paid for that transactional politics. That in fact the only way to really arrive at a proper management structure for pandemics in the future is to engage in a full and proper debate. And I say that that should be after a full and proper review of the pandemic management that we have had in Victoria and more broadly in the past 19 months.
Thank you, Dr. Cumming.
Thank you, Mr President. And I stand to speak on the Pandemic Health and Wellbeing Pandemic Management Bill of 2021. And where do I start with this bill? If I said everything I wanted to on this bill and covered everything that was wrong with it, it would take far more than my allocated time of 30 minutes. I, like a number of other members, expected a bill specifically for the management of a pandemic, rather than amendments to the Public and Health and Wellbeing Act. In his second reading speech, the Minister for Health said that the bill created a regulatory framework, and I'll quote, that supports transparent and accountable government action to keep Victorians safe during pandemics, end quote. This bill does not do that. It creates a framework of the unholy trinity made up of the Premier, the Minister for Health and the Chief Health Officer. It says that there's going to be a separation of powers. SARC. Apparently, they will somehow be involved and disallow. I want to just laugh out loud. According to this bill, the Premier can make a pandemic declaration even when it isn't the case of disease in Victoria or even Australia, as long as he sees that it has, quote, pandemic potential. In this bill, it contains a definition of a pandemic disease, and let me quote, For the purposes of this Act, an infectious disease is a pandemic disease at a particular time if, at that time, there is a pandemic outbreak of an infectious disease, end quote. Now that's laughable. A definition that uses the word pandemic to define what one is. Now, it's like saying that the definition of running is walking at a running pace. For the information of the government, who apparently doesn't know, the World Health Organization declares when an infectious disease is a pandemic, rather than the Premier. And the definition of pandemic and who declares a pandemic is on the Federal Health Direct website. Members of the government might find it enlightening reading. After the Premier makes a pandemic declaration, he can expand that declaration endlessly without any oversight by the Parliament, even when there are no cases. Now, over the last 18 months, there has been constant request for the health advice to be published, and none has been forthcoming. We were promised briefings by the Chief Health Officer, and besides a few quick 30 minutes for briefings and questions, we haven't had one for months, July to be exact. So we don't know if all of the directives, the mandates, the orders we have been given and have been based on health advice. We don't know. But does this bill give us a framework that is based on health advice? I don't believe that it does. Now, this government doesn't seem to realise that they have lost the trust of a lot of Victorians and of a lot of the members of this House. And this bill does nothing to bring that back. It doesn't release the health advice at the time of making the orders, but days later. And we are meant to believe that this advice isn't being rewritten to match the orders. Why isn't it released at the same time as the orders? That is my question. But even more worrying is that this government has ignored the normal structures put in place to manage a crisis or a disaster. Structures that are used by Emergency Management Victoria and by corporate business. Structures that use a team of experts to provide the advice. A team of experts from a wide range of disciplines. Has this government learnt nothing from the last 18 months? They may wish to blame the federal government for a flawed vaccine rollout, but the truth is they didn't run proper education programs. They didn't use the GPs and the pharmacists until a couple of months ago. They didn't tap into the resources of local government and the multicultural communities until just of late. They didn't use a place-based approach. They could have tapped into the expertise and resources of local government over 18 months ago, if not longer. Local government knows their communities. They know their leaders. They are incredible resources, and they are an arm of the state. Instead of using council facilities for testing and vaccinations, they set up tents and drive-through hubs. So council buildings sat unused and many council staff had no work. It was an incredible waste of resources. And I want to touch on that. In my area, in High Point, they set up pop-up tents in the car park, and then the people who were tested walked in to High Point rather than using the council facilities. At that time, when we had an outbreak in Maidstone, they only rang Maribyrnong City Council and requested if they could open up the community facility to use the toilet. rather than actually all of the community facilities across the whole of Victoria, you could have been using them. You could have thrown that money, and that money would have lasted for 20, 30 years, upgrading toilets, upgrading facilities. But no, pop-up tents, pop-up facilities. And 12 months ago, when we debated the state of emergency, and I raised that in the Health and Wellbeing Act, it's a clear section on the council, but nothing. No. Well, obviously, we haven't been spoken to at all. They didn't manage our hospitals and the emergency services properly. They certainly didn't manage quarantine properly. And they didn't run good multicultural education campaigns, and when I demanded it from the start. Instead, they used a big stick and mandates. They gave us endless lockdowns, the longest of any city in the world. They locked us up in our homes for over 20 hours a day because of their incompetence. They closed our schools, they closed our playgrounds, they closed our places of worship. They stopped us from seeing our family and friends. They stopped us from celebrating marriages. They stopped us from farewelling the people that we lost. They stopped us from dining out and having a drink in a pub, in a street, in a park. They made us wear masks outside when nobody was around. They made us get vaccinated, mandated, rather than around the world, no mandates. They created a divided community who will still be locked out for many of these things for months to come, if not years, if this government gets re-elected. They spent $172 million on PPE that was not fit for purpose. $172 million. Could you imagine, local government, how you could have spent that? They paid an organisation chaired by a former Labor minister $770,000 to manage the Working for Victoria program without a competitive tender. They overpaid $14 million in the first round of business support package. They contracted a senior exec to the health department for a year, paying them $595,000 a year, with only one quote. That's $250 more than what was quoted in the job description, and $230,000 more than the relevant public service paid band. They lacked effective fraud controls in some, and you might laugh about the effective fraud controls at this time, but the community is not laughing at the money that you've actually wasted. In some of the government departments and in their response to COVID, they have left the Victorian taxpayers exposed to waste and corruption. There is nothing in this bill, nothing, that will stop them from doing the same things over and over again. If anything, it grants them the power to do even more. Their attitude to this bill, and to myself and to other people in this crossbench, has been disrespectful, personal, and wrong. And it's appalling, and it shows the same contempt they have for every Victorian. The way you show contempt to me is showing contempt to every single person in Western Metropolitan Region. You're giggling, you're laughing, and what you can go for it. Go step outside. Go step outside. If you wish to continue, go step outside. For this Parliament and its financial management, the first we heard of this bill was late in the afternoon on Monday the 25th of October. Why I know this is the day after my birthday, Mr President. They offered their 3 pet crossbenchers a briefing then, as well as the opposition. Not me. I'm only a doctor of Chinese medicine and trained for a pandemic when I wear my army uniform. I am also horrified if the report in the media on the weekend is correct and the government is in its talks with the 3 crossbenchers on amendments to this bill and hasn't spoken to us. They certainly haven't asked me. I've had a long list of improvements that can be made. I was sent their amendments at 9:36 p.m. last night. Would you normally be in bed?
They said they're talking to you since March.
Oh, well, not me. And at 9:29 this morning, I received an invitation to attend a briefing on the amendments, along with the remaining crossbenchers. Aren't we lucky? That's the 11th hour. That's not even 12 hours. I mean, it isn't it? At 9:30 at night, when most people sleep, and then you get up in the morning and then you're meant to jump into a brief. It's wonderful. I appreciate. But at least they can tick a box and say that they sent me the amendments and tick a box and say they briefed us. The briefing was held an hour later. That just shows the attitude of this government to the opposition and the crossbenchers. And I have still not been offered or received a briefing on the legislation itself. Don't keep choking. We first saw the bill when it went to the Assembly, and we had less than 3 weeks to read this bill, to read what is the worst piece of legislation that I have ever seen in my 25 years. It contains nothing less than a drastic overreach of powers by an already power-mad Premier. It contains the ability to target people on the basis of their characteristics, their attitudes or circumstances, and then exempts the government from the Equal Opportunity Act. It breaches our human rights. There are pandemic orders and pandemic management powers and pandemic management order powers and pandemic management general powers. That's an awful lot of powers, and far too much power is delegated to authorised officers. You would need a whiteboard or a PowerPoint presentation to work it out. Now, let me be blunt. This bill does not provide transparency or accountability. It says that the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee will have the oversight, a committee that is already controlled by the government. I am embarrassed by a lot of these committees and who chairs them. I am embarrassed that some of the members of this House think that it is acceptable, especially since they didn't grant leave for the committee to examine the bill before it came into this House as requested by the opposition, and since the committee initially refused to examine the bill. Now, I think that we should just delete the whole section relating to SARC and insert some oversight by Parliament. Then there is an independent Pandemic Management Advisory Committee. Currently, we have a toothless tiger without any real powers. Now, an independent Pandemic Management Advisory Committee. Now, this is a group that should contain the expertise, the healthcare, human rights, local government, doctors, pharmacists, multicultural, legal businesses, the list could go on, but these would be experts in their fields. This is a group that knows how our community will be affected. This would be a group made up of independent experts that should be advising the Minister. This is a group that should be making the recommendations. While I will oppose this bill with every fibre in my body, I will also be putting up amendments. Now, I am putting up amendments so the government can see what a good emergency management framework really looks like. Could you please circulate my amendments?
Is the amendment be circulated, please? Coming. Wait.
But they include a workable definition of the pandemic, the requirement that the disease must be presented in Victoria before making a declaration, that the declaration can only be extended up to a maximum of 12 months and every extension must be approved by the Parliament. The Parliament must continue to sit throughout the declaration, that the membership of the advisory group is expanded and that they are responsible for advice and recommendations to the Minister, that changes are made to be published of the health advice and in most cases immediately released, and the removal of SARC to provide oversight. Now, 60 QCs have problems with this bill. One of the ones I know is a big Tory ALP. The Law Institute of Victoria has problems with this bill. They have published a 24-page position paper with 32 recommendations. Now, even the Ombudsman has come out today saying that there is a need for greater transparency than what this bill provides. Her office has been able to provide independent review on detention orders, but would no longer be able to do that under this bill. She said, and I'll quote her, "I will no longer be able to do that under this legislation because the decision-making will move from the Chief Health Officer to the Premier or the Minister for Health, and I don't review decisions by ministers," end quote. This bill needs to go back and be rewritten. Their amendments are not enough. They are simply a half-hearted attempt to say that they have listened to what Victorians have said. If they really listened to the voice of Victorians, to all the independent voices, they would have been making a lot more amendments or scrapping the bill altogether. I will be opposing this bill. But I'd like to also just touch on some of the contributions that were made by others today, and I can make a guess at some of the ones that will go after me. So it is not right that there have been 3 of the crossbench targeted, and some of those targeting during this debate is wrong. I have gone to these protests and the vast majority are peaceful. And I must say that any time I've ever seen someone who are doing the wrong things, I've actually gone up to them and actually have requested that they change their behaviour and be compassionate and use their heart. I can understand why a lot of people are angry. They've lost their businesses. They feel desperate. They don't know what to actually do. Because the information hasn't been given and the government hasn't been transparent with the health advice, there has been many a time where people fill that gap, which has been sad. I take great offence by this government and the amount of words that have been used directed towards the protesters, such as being neo-Nazis. I take great offence. Why do I take great offence? I'm part of that. My mother is German. My family was protecting Jews in their village. During this time, the government took aim at the Jewish community. But then, in the same breath, happily call others neo-Nazis. I've heard this here. Mr Medic here has also used the term. He directed it at me today, talking about...
is a neo-Nazi.
Craig Carrot. That's well, Mr Medic, I will take...
Leaders of that
Yeah. So Mr. Medic, who is here today, even during this pandemic, I was walking out to on Anzac Day on the steps of this Parliament, and to actually support the Royal Commission into Veteran Suicide. Now, Mr. Medic came marching past me, and he told me that he was leaving because there were neo-Nazis out there. And I walked out there. Go on, no, Mr. Medic, please. I will absolutely take this up, because you actually just saw a bunch of leather jackets.
Dr. Cumming, thank you. Ms. Stepstow on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what this has got to do with the bill, and I'd ask that the member come back to debating the point of the bill. Thank you.
On the point of order. Mr. Finn.
Mr. President, I think the point that Dr. Cumming is making is very relevant to many of the points that have been made by a number of speakers in this debate in the chamber today, and indeed in the media publicly. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for Dr. Cumming to respond in the manner that she is.
Thank you. Ms. Stepstow on a further point of order.
No point of order there. Was debating the point of order.
Ms. Dr. Cumming on a point of order.
No, I'm wanting to continue my contribution. Okay. Not a problem.
My understanding that Ms. Stepstow's point of order was about your debate about the bill, not the conversation between you and Mr. Medic. And I understand, Mr. Finn, that you took that because of the bill and the interjection. But I ask you to come back to the motion. Thank you.
And I will, because Mr. Medic actually saw what the veterans, the Vietnam veterans that were outside. And all he saw was leather jackets. But if he actually went out there and spoke to the veterans that were there, the Vietnam veterans that were there.
Point of order. Dr. Cumming is making an outrageous accusation, President. She is claiming that I saw Vietnam veterans in leather jackets and thought they were neo-Nazis on that day. That is not what the case was. That is a misrepresentation, and it needs to be withdrawn. I saw a known neo-Nazi reporter out there with his neo-Nazi mate, and that's who I spoke to her about. I like her to withdraw that section. Thank you.
Mr. Medic, thank you for raising the point of order. If you took it as an accusation, I asked Dr. Cumming to withdraw your comment.
Mr. President, he did say to me in front of my gay friend, so I have a witness, that he called them neo-Nazis. He goes, I'm not standing out there with them, I'm going inside the neo-Nazis.
Dr. Cumming, when I ask for something, can you please do not get involved into debate? I have asked you to withdraw, and I expect you to withdraw.
I'll move on.
Now, have you withdrawn? Now you come back to the bill.
Thank you.
Please.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Not a problem, Mr. President. But then I guess I can make another point, that when others are in protest being called neo-Nazis, that, and again, this is not about the point that we were just raising, Mr. President. This is about another time when Craig Cole was marching from or walking from Williamstown to Torquay. He saw tents and he called them neo-Nazis as well. So it is not the first time that either someone here in the crossbench or the government has called us names here. And I find it really offensive that even when Dr. Ratman earlier today was talking about the nooses, and I've seen that during the extinguished rebellion like climate change. They are burning prams, they are burning effigies of people.
Come back to the bill, please, Dr. Cumming.
I will. Thank you, Mr. President. But I find it unusual to be, throughout this pandemic, I have been, from the government, used propaganda towards myself and others, and it's all on Hansard, from tin foils, hats, to Trump supporters, to what other language that you've used at myself or others, conspiracy theorist, when simply it has been about pro-choice, no mandates, treating the Victorian community as adults, showing them the actual health advice, not acting like you know something better than somebody else, respecting your unions, respecting the workers' voices and what they actually have to say, rather than saying that even your union members are baby Nazis, or painting a brush when they are just hard-working Victorians.
Cumming, thank you. Minister Stitt on the point of order.
Point of order, President. I think that Dr Cumming is attributing comments to government members that have simply never been said in this place, and I would ask you to ask her to withdraw them. I think she's actually confusing comments made by people who are not members of this parliament.
Thank you. My understanding from... Oh, sorry, Mr Naldachi.
Thank you, President. On the point of order, the Minister knows better than this. She can deal with this by way of her own substantive contribution or doing it by way of substantive motion.
Cumming was just debating the issue. Dr Cumming, please continue.
And thank you, Mr. President. I'll take that point, and I'll say it's the ALP federal government rather than this Victorian government. So if you're not connected with Bill Shorten, I apologise. But that's okay. If you're distancing yourself from Bill Shorten, I understand that. But for myself, and then others here who have picked on my family, but then come into this chamber and are upset. Now, I don't support anyone picking on anybody's family or making anyone's family unsafe, but I will not be accused at any stage or time that any of my staff have actually jumped on anyone's social media or have actually done anything to the crossbenchers here.
Thank you. Mr Maddock.
Thank you, President. In the words of Brian Taylor, wowza! From the outset, President, I want to do three things before I address this important bill. Firstly, I want to thank my team, all of them. What they've had to watch, what they've had to endure over this legislation, the vitriol, the rancour, the vile abuse and threats and phone calls. They didn't sign up for that, and neither did my family. I'll say no more about that because I don't want to give people that don't deserve it any more attention, other than to say to my team and family, to the many thousands of people who wrote letters of support, my family and my party, thank you. It seems not enough, but it's all I've got left in the tank. Secondly, I want to thank my colleagues, Ms Patton and Dr Ratnam, for their level-headed approach through all of this. They have been the subject of some of the most disgusting, frightening misogynistic abuse, as has my Chief of Staff, Georgie Purcell, an extraordinary young woman who hasn't deserved the abuse and accusations that have come her way. To my friend Gary Hall and his husband Michael, I am so sorry. The sort of stuff that's been levelled at you, in all honesty, I didn't think Victorians were capable of it. The sort of vitriol we haven't seen since Tony Abbott attacked Julia Gillard. I found myself as, and I quote, let's bring it back. Let's remember the images of Tony Abbott standing under a sign that said, "Ditch the witch, kill Julia Gillard." That was on the signs. That was him. That was the stuff that he was endorsing. That's what I'm talking about. I found myself as worried for their personal safety as I am for my own family. And I will address the behaviour of some in detail shortly. And let me just add, if this level of bile was directed at Miss Crozier, at Miss Bath, at my Anime Digne, Mrs MacArthur, I would defend them in a heartbeat. All women are at the mercy of acts of ratbaggery committed by men, and none of them should have to endure it. Thirdly, it would be remiss of me not to address why we're even here in this situation at all. Something that in all the commotion, the emotion, the lies and the hatred that everyone wants to ignore. We're in this predicament because we continue, even after 5 million deaths, over 5 million deaths, to fail to even acknowledge what has caused us to be here. We use its descriptive. We apply the best available minds and scientific processes to combat it. We mention it daily, hourly. We have lost what it truly is. We're in this predicament because of a zoonotic disease. We're in this terrible space because we continue, even in the face of our own failings and mass mortality, to recognise that we did this. We're here because we exploit animals. These diseases are born of the petri dish that is industrialised agriculture and habitat destruction. But in our collective stupidity, instead of dealing with the cause, we fight and cause social disruption over how to handle the symptoms. Right in the middle of lockdowns and restrictions, we were sent another warning about where that can lead in my own electorate. Whilst we were looking over here, over there, nature once again shouted out for attention, our attention, to stop doing what causes it. We had an outbreak of not one, not two, but 3 different strains of highly virulent avian influenza in factory-farmed chicken sheds in my electorate. Hundreds of thousands of souls crammed into cages to satisfy the human stomach at the risk of our own lives. One even made the jump to emus, again, in our arrogance, being farmed, with thousands of adults and thousands of chicks having to be killed to quell that outbreak. President, I've spoken in this chamber before about the looming threat of a pandemic due to our reliance on the consumption of animals. And I know there's been the usual jokes that every vegan has heard ad nauseum. But let me just say this. When you next sit down to eat your animal of choice, as you lift that fork to your mouth, please take a moment, 1 moment, and ask yourself this. Are my actions at this moment contributing to the suffering of animals and to the spread of disease? I've all but given up trying to talk to people who have no desire to change. But you need to realise that exploiting animals in this way kills people. Remember that animals plus exploitation equals zoonotic disease equals pandemics. Now, President, I don't intend to cover in this address all aspects of this bill, at least in detail. That has been done at length already from all sides, whether you agree with it or whether you don't. There's no point going back over that ground and raking those hot coals. But in broad terms, it answers the problems that were continually raised in this chamber and in the public of the failings of dealing with a worldwide killer pandemic using state of emergency legislation as the framework. Many here have spent the last 18 months or more complaining that the Chief Health Officer should not have the power to make orders and restrictions, that those powers should reside with the Minister and Premier. Well, now they will. During debate in this place in September, the Shadow Health Minister said, "We want those extended powers removed from the Chief Health Officer from a bureaucrat." We think that is an overreach in power in this chamber. Even the opposition leader on October 9 stood in front of the cameras and stated that the power to declare and manage a pandemic should reside with the Premier and the Health Minister. This bill does what the opposition called for. But not content with getting what they wanted, their song changes tune. President, I want to take a moment to thank Professor Brett Sutton and Jerome Weimar, two public officials who have handled themselves with compassion, with dignity and respect, and with a degree of professionalism throughout this awful time that we can all seek to emulate, all of us. This state owes them a debt of gratitude, and I, for one, am grateful. The opposition and others called for more oversight. It's happening. Independence and transparency, they're happening too. Greater respect for human rights, flexibility in where and how an area is managed. The list goes on. And I just want to take up, just for one moment, and I hear what Dr. Barker said about the Ombudsman, and I do recall, I think it was him, forgive me if it wasn't, but somebody mentioned from the opposition about the Commissioner for Human Rights. Well, I know the Commissioner well. I know Ro Allen extremely well. Here we go, what? I received a text message from her stating that she was misrepresented, oh, surprise, surprise, by the Herald Sun, and that she supports the legislation. So there's a clarification for you. The opposition and others have called for more oversight. It's happening. Independence and transparency, they're happening too. Greater respect for human rights, flexibility in where and how an area is managed, the list goes on. That is because Ms Patton, Dr Ratnam and I did listen. While those that made the choice to politicise public safety by stoking the flames of hate went on a little tour of indulging conspiracy theorists, neo-Nazis, Trumpist morons, and those that believe in lizard people, we went about our jobs. We went about our jobs. We met the experts. We put ours and your concerns to the government. And based upon more input from all sides, we pushed the issues and through open, honest and respectful dialogue, changed a good bill into a better one. I want to take a moment, though, to acknowledge my crossbench colleagues who, though they might not support this bill, did not engage in disgusting behaviour that others have.
Sorry,
your
Mr.
dignity
Medic,
and
Mr.
your
Medic,
respect
Mr. Medic,
is seen.
Mr. Medic, I have to interrupt and call the Minister.
President, pursuant to Standing Order 4.08, I declare the sitting be extended by up to 1 hour.
Thank you. Mr. Medic, to continue.
Sorry, President. I didn't realise the time.
Mr. President, Mr. Medic actually said that there were people in the crossbench that had disgusting behaviour. I'd like him to withdraw that remark.
Order, but I'm sorry, Dr. Cumming. It's not a point of order. Mr. Medic, continue. Mr. Medic, continue.
Thank you. To repeat myself, your dignity and your respect is seen, it's noted, it's appreciated. Because you see, that's what responsible politicians do. They don't indulge in dog whistling. They don't indulge in incitement. President, as I said, my colleagues have spoken about the finer points of this bill from all sides, whether they agree with it or whether they don't. But I want you all, inside this House and outside, to know that I am proud to have had a major input into the crafting of this bill, to have made suggestions that have been taken up, to have suggested amendments that have been made, quietly, calmly, without hysteria and tantrums, like an adult. I want to take a few moments to discuss recent events and how I am astounded at how they are a direct and frightening example of life imitating art. You see, I'm a huge fan of Ben Elton as an entertainer, but more particularly as an author. And in November 2007, he released his then latest literary effort, Blind Faith, a work of fiction then, but what in now is 2021, a commentary on current events and a warning of what is just around the corner. The book describes a world where climate change has resulted in sea levels rising to such a degree that whole nations have been lost, exactly what is being experienced in the South Pacific right now. Billions have perished and disease runs rampant. That's the easy bit. Humanity has changed to become a society where the cult of self is what matters. Bodily autonomy at the expense of collective good. All ruled over by a group think of worshipping not a God, as some in this chamber do, but the love. An interpretation of an omnipotent being who speaks to your local confessor, who decrees that vaccines and medicine are the work of heretics and science is the devil. The small pockets of people who cling to reality are sought out, brutalised and publicly executed to appease the mob. All led by a group of high priest figures who whip them into a frenzy for their own political ends. Sounds like what we've seen here of late, isn't it?
Mr. Medic, thank you. Mr. Finn, on
Mr. President, I don't doubt that the book is a damn good read by the sound of it, but what the hell has it got to do with the bill? I mean, this is a piece of fiction that Mr. Medic is quoting as, well, I'm not sure why he's quoting it at the minute, but it doesn't seem to me to have anything to do with the bill at all.
Just to touch. So just to touch on the point, is the point being made that vaccines are tested on animals?
Mr. Medic, thank you. There's no point of order. Thank you, Mr. Medic. Continue.
To clarify for Mr. Finn, thank you, President. The point was being made in the last sentence I had while you're about to make a point of order, that it sounds like what we're seeing here of late, out the front and everywhere else, doesn't it? Because those in this chamber who chose to appear to the baying mob, parading the hangman's noose, chanting cries to kill human beings have
No point of
incited
order. Thank you,
and
Mr.
fueled
Medic.
hate in this
Continue.
community. And let me be clear, you don't have to use words of hate. It's not what you say that matters. Just by turning up, by standing on that podium and them seeing you there, you legitimised their hate, their violence, their racism, their misogyny. When you stood with them, when you walked with them, that's the standard you accepted. And no matter how much you deny it, your words of denial mean nothing.
Your words mean nothing.
President, colleagues, comrades.
Thank you. Order. You know those interjections not acceptable in the chamber, and it's an invitation for Mr. Medic as well. So, please, Mr. Medic, please continue.
Thank you, President. President, colleagues, comrades, I've worked on this bill in a collaborative way. I've questioned the Minister and others with genuine concern when I didn't think it was right. I shut out the baying hounds of hysteria to do my job, and I will continue to as we move through the committee stage of this bill. I have a large number of questions to ask because that is my contribution as well to the proper examination of this bill. I hope the answers will satisfy not only me, but also those who have genuine concerns. That, after all, is my job, and I will do it with as much dignity and rational process as I am able. I hope with all my heart that's enough. To my friends, those who have stayed and those who have gone, I hope that's enough for you. And I commend this bill to the House.
Ms. Maxwell.
Thank you, President. I rise to speak on the Public Health and Wellbeing Pandemic with over the last 18 months who have contacted me about this specific bill. It still accumulates substantial power in the hands of a chosen few. region in the world. I have repeatedly raised in this Parliament that these restrictions were imposed time and again on places without cases of COVID-19. Places like Corryong, which only contracted its first COVID case in October this year, where children were forced out of school to remote learning, many of them in places with little or no internet. Businesses were closed, tourism shut, and people mandated to wear masks in public places, even when they were alone, even when they were walking in a paddock on their own. Instead of pursuing ways to proportionately manage restrictions and apply some balance against the risk in our regional areas, these places without cases were forced to live under much of the same blanket restrictions as those living in metropolitan regions. Echoing the concerns of Liberty Victoria, people have been deeply frustrated that neither the health advice or other analysis that underpins these restrictions has ever been made public. This information should be made public, whether the government is legally obliged to or not. I know the government will say that if this bill is passed, they will now provide this information. But my question is, why hasn't it been made public through the ongoing lockdowns that we've all endured across Victoria? Following the passage of this bill, it is highly likely, if not a guarantee, that this government will make a pandemic declaration immediately, even with 90% of the population fully vaccinated. The curve flattened, the risk is reduced as much as possible through vaccination rates. This could go on for years, even though the government says we are now living with COVID. Granted, the Minister now will have to publish the health advice, but we don't really know how detailed this will be, and it doesn't have to be published at the same time the declaration is made. Further, if the government fails to publish the health advice, the orders aren't rescinded, they stay. Liberty Victoria makes a very solid point that the responsible person should report to Parliament on any order made under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, not just pandemic orders, because all such matters are of public concern, and we are here to serve them, not the other way around. The focus on detention and punitive measures in the bill are also of concern to us. We cannot support a public health response that focuses on detention, exclusion, policing and fines, whether that relates to warrantless entries, extensive mandates for vaccines, curfews or border closures. And we've seen plenty of those. The detention review processes are limited to the department reviewing itself and provide little or no apparent means for other orders to be challenged. Through this pandemic, we saw thousands of people excluded from entering their home state and returning to their private place of residence, some for months, and there seems to be no provision for them to have their matter reviewed. The role of SARC in scrutinising orders is an improvement to the current situation. However, this doesn't happen on every order, only when they consider it necessary. The independent committee doesn't require representation of small business, education, mental health, or an explicit understanding of regional and rural areas. The initial state of emergency was declared on the 16th of March 2020 for the purpose of flattening the curve of hospitalisation and to prepare our health system. I can understand that preparing the health system for a pandemic disease is no easy feat, but I cannot understand that when our health system has been operating close to full capacity, that there was little means available to expand and prepare it to respond. Fixing this will be vital to supporting our health workforce in the future and ensuring we don't have to lock down citizens for 18 months instead. I cannot speak on this bill without expressing my disappointment that 3 crossbenchers were actively brought into the fold of the government to participate on the development of this legislation to the express exclusion of others. I have worked cooperatively and collaboratively with this government on important matters, including supporting victims of crime, the initiation of the VLRC review into stalking, the BRV review of tobacco regulation, and even last sitting week on adding female-specific cancers to the list of presumptive rights for our firefighters. For the government to push this through the Legislative Assembly as it did, to skip the scrutiny of SARC, to skip public consultation or the release of an exposure draft is an opportunity lost to allow the people we serve to have their voice. These issues were raised by the President of the Victorian Bar. The government is asking the public to trust it, but it has already compromised this trust through the lack of transparency and due diligence by which this legislation was developed. I know this legislation will pass, but I hope the government chooses very sparingly to use it. I thank the House.
Thank you, Ms Maxwell. The Minister.
Thank you, Deputy President, and I'll take some opportunity to sum up on this bill and hopefully acquit a few issues that were raised ahead of the committee stage on Thursday. I've certainly taken note that many members have commenced their contributions with quotes, and I might do the same. The bill was not unexpected. It was foreshadowed by the government in public statements, including during the debate in this place on the extension of the state of emergency. And in March this year, I said, the government has committed to developing COVID-specific legislation in seeking the 9-month extension. The Victorian government is committed to working on legislation that will ensure Victoria has access to the essential powers we need to manage the pandemic without having to extend what has become quite an inflammatory term, the state of emergency. The bill does exactly what we said it would. The ability to respond to an emergency and protect the health and safety of its citizens is an essential function of government. The bill is designed to enable the government to do this, to respond to a pandemic that, on the advice of the CHO, poses a serious risk to public health. I also note that during the debate in March on the extension of the state of emergency, Mr Davis made some important comments, and I would like to echo them here today. The community want to see a more systematic process. They want to see a calmer process. They want to see a process where there is more consultation, and they want to see a transparent process. The public debate and commentary around this bill have been far from calm. It's been hyperbolic, it's been inflammatory, and has sought to undermine the confidence that Victorians have in the democratic process that this place and our government are committed to uphold. These powers are not, as the loud and misleading voices have sought to claim, unprecedented. In fact, if you look at what's happened over the last 20 months, these are very precedented. And as we've seen here in Victoria and interstate and internationally, this is not unprecedented anymore. These same powers are in use in New South Wales and South Australia, both without the transparency and accountability that this bill will provide. It's important to note that the government had 3 options. We could have sought to extend the state of emergency yet again and left the powers and provisions in the Act enacted over a decade ago as they currently are, without the transparency and accountability that we have proposed. We could have let the state of emergency expire, which would have left the government without any power to make orders to protect Victorians from the continuing risk of the pandemic. Or the government could do what we're doing now, take the immense tough lessons of the last 20 months and introduce a new fit-for-purpose legislation for pandemic emergencies. I'm proud that we've taken the latter route. The bill strengthens the accountability, transparency and scrutiny of our pandemic response in a way that sets a new standard. The state of emergency powers have been essential for preventing COVID in the past 20 months. It hasn't been easy, but it certainly has saved lives. Victorians have sacrificed so much to protect their families, friends and their whole communities. We've all lived how these powers can be used. But now we are at the turning point in this pandemic, and we are just days away from reaching 90% of the Victorian population having 2 doses of vaccination. As we move into this new phase, there are still some critical things that we will need to continue to keep Victorians safe, and without this legislation, I must note, we would be unable to maintain vaccination requirements that have helped in increasing vaccination rates. The requirements, of course, are particularly important for high-risk settings such as schools and educational settings in which young children are not able to be vaccinated, healthcare workers who are more likely to come into contact with the virus, aged care and disability care workers who support some of the most vulnerable in our community. Additionally, we still need to be able to limit the spread spread of the virus when people are confirmed as positive and require them to isolate and get tested until they no longer pose a risk of further spreading. We will continue to require the wearing of masks, particularly in high-risk settings, as appropriate. As international travel increases, we need to be able to reduce the risk of the virus arriving and spreading in our communities, particularly as we know this will pose a particular risk to those people who are unvaccinated. As we have seen in the past year, new variants of concern can emerge and we may need the ability to quickly respond to any new variants from overseas. Over the past 20 months, the world has gone through something that we did not foresee, a global pandemic that had the effect on everyone around the world in some way. A pandemic is an extraordinary event, and under this bill, the declaration of pandemic powers for the unique powers required for the government to respond to such event are provided for. There are a number of requirements in the bill that provide checks and balances on the pandemic declaration. I've certainly been concerned that some MPs have raised in their contribution that there's going to be declarations made on a whim. This is the process. The Minister for Health and the Chief Health Officer must provide advice to the Premier to inform the Premier's decision, including on whether there is a serious risk to public health in Victoria arising from a pandemic or disease of pandemic potential. And the Premier can only make a pandemic declaration if they are satisfied on reasonable grounds that there is a serious risk to public health of Victorians arising from a pandemic or a disease of pandemic potential. And it goes without saying that there needs to be an actual, real-world pandemic before this power can be exercised. The Premier must also prepare a report to be tabled in Parliament that includes a statement of reasons for making, varying, extending or revoking pandemic declaration, a copy of the advice provided by the Minister and the Chief Health Officer in respect of making, varying, extending or revoking a pandemic declaration, and where a declaration is being varied, extended or revoked, a summary of the pandemic orders made, the public health risk powers and pandemic management powers exercised over the period the pandemic declaration was enforced prior to the variation, extension or revocation. The Premier must revoke the pandemic declaration as soon as they are satisfied that the pandemic disease or disease of pandemic potential no longer presents a serious risk to public health. Our experience has illustrated that, unlike other emergency situations like flood or fire, a pandemic can last for many months, unfortunately even years. The total duration that a pandemic will pose a serious risk to public health is difficult to anticipate, and it's impractical to place limits on the number of renewals of pandemic declaration. Under this bill, a declaration can be made for 28 days in the first instance and then 3 months thereafter. Each time that the declaration extended, it must be based on the advice that there continues to be serious risk to public health of Victorians. Having no outer limit on the period of a declaration is an important reason that this bill has been introduced and provides the security government needs to keep critical public health measures in place that address unpredictable and constantly evolving risks for as long as necessary to protect public health. This approach also reflects best practice in other Australian jurisdictions, but I would say no other jurisdiction in Australia has an outer limit on their ability to make a declaration in response to a pandemic emergency. In fact, in New South Wales, they do not even require a declaration in order for the Minister for Health to use the broad powers that have been used in response to COVID-19. It's important to note that the checks and balances go beyond the declarations itself. Once a declaration is made, any time the Minister for Health uses any power under the declaration, there are further checks and balances on those orders. The CHO advice they are based on must be tabled. A Minister's statement on the use of powers must be tabled. An explanation of how limitations on charter rights are demonstratively justified must be tabled. An independent advisory committee reviews the orders. SARC is able to review the orders, and the advice of the CHO and the charter explanation and the Minister's statement are tabled within 4 sitting days, and that is grounds for SARC to recommend a disallowance to the Houses of Parliament. I'm out of breath, there's that many accountability measures.
Ignore. They're not interested.
I've listened to everyone's contributions and attempted to answer everybody's detail. I've spent quite some time making sure that I'm addressing the issues that people have raised, Ms Crozier. It wouldn't be request too much of your time to listen, but you don't have to be in here if you don't want to. When making decisions under the bill, there is has been some discussion about the interactions with the Charter. Through the consultation on this bill, the question of how the Charter interacts with the decisions made under the bill came up several times, particularly from legal and human rights organisations. In response, the government is proposing amendments to the bill in 2 key ways. First, we wish to replace the objective provision in section 665A2 with wording clarifying that Parliament recognises the importance of protecting human rights in managing the serious risk to life, public health and wellbeing presented by the outbreak or spread of pandemics and diseases of pandemic potential, intends that nothing in the new part will displace the operation of the Charter, and intends that the Charter applies to the interpretation of the new part, the interpretation of subordinate instruments under the new part, and acts done and decisions made under the new part by public authorities. It's actually quite technical, but this revised wording does provide greater clarity that there is no intention to displace the usual operations of the Charter. In addition, to improve the transparency of pandemic orders, the bill requires the Minister to publish and table an explanation of the human rights impacts of pandemic orders each time an order is made, vary or extended. The second key amendment is to provide greater clarity as to what the Minister is required to publish. Section 185AP will require the Minister for Health to publish an explanation of whether, in the opinion of the Minister, an order does or does not limit Charter rights, and if an order does limit Charter right, the nature of the right limited, the importance of the purpose of the limitation, the nature and extent of the limitation, the relationship between the limitation and the purpose, and whether there are any less restrictive means that were reasonably available to achieve the purpose of the order. Much has been made of the Minister's ability to make pandemic orders that differ in their application to different groups of people based on their different attributes. The purpose of Section 165AK3 is to enable the Minister to create targeted pandemic orders which apply differently to different categories of people. This is important because pandemic risks are not the same for all sections of our community. For example, a disease might be more dangerous to elderly people, or a person may be at greater risk if they are unvaccinated. These provisions are about avoiding blanket restrictions that apply to everyone where that may not be needed. Having targeted orders that apply to those most at risk is one way we can avoid overbroad restrictions. There were different ways to draft these options. It was open to us to achieve this goal through a variety of measures, and I want to explain why we're proposing new drafting in our amendments. At the moment, the bill makes reference to the Equal Opportunity Act in setting out how these differentiated orders might be made. We've heard strong feedback that this approach has led to concerns that the powers might be misused in the future, for example, to make orders differentiating on the grounds that have no relation to public health risks such as political belief. These concerns have been fuelled by inflammatory and speculative statements about how the bill works. And we've seen today in this place that despite repeated statements clarifying the intention of the provisions, wild speculation has continued. What's more, despite government amendments having been circulated and put this beyond doubt, the opposition continue to fearmonger about what these provisions would enable. So, as I've said, the provisions were never intended to enable pandemic orders to be applied in a way that discriminates on irrelevant attributes. We could have just come into this chamber and explained that, but instead we want to make it abundantly clear to the community that the concerns that have been raised are unfounded, so much so that we can achieve the intended outcomes of the provision without referring to the Equal Opportunity Act. Our proposed amendments will, as has always been the intention, make it clear that these provisions enable pandemic orders to differentiate among groups of people based on characteristics that are relevant to the public health risk.
Thank you. Mr Davis on a point of order.
I'm thankful the Minister is making a lengthy contribution here, but did she say fear-mongering? And if so, I'd just ask her, she withdraw it. And you were speaking quickly.
What did she say?
Did you use the word fear-mongering? Was that correct? In relation to other parties? You did. Well, I'd ask you withdraw it.
Thank you.
I would also point out that the Chief Health Officer's directions already distinguish between different settings of public health risk.
Order. First of all, Mr Davis raised a point of order. I haven't ruled out yet whatever my decision will be. And then you talking from there, please. All right, thank you. Thank you.
Misleading the House.
Finish. Mr Davis, I understand your point of order, but I don't think the word you described is an unparliamentary. Look, I don't want to get involved in this. I've made my ruling. Thank you very much. Ms. Symes.
Thank you, President. I would also point out that the CHO's directions already distinguish between different settings and public health risk attributes. For example, we know that COVID-19 vaccine reduces the risk of severe disease, the risk of transmission, the risk of death, and now we have the available supply. Orders are made that distinguish between those who are vaccinated and those who are unvaccinated. Differentiation also occurs in hospital settings and aged care settings where additional protections are required to keep vulnerable people safe. And Victoria is not unique in using emergency powers for these exact measures. For example, countries such as the US, Denmark, Norway, Switzerland and Indonesia all have in place different forms of vaccination requirements for particular groups of people or people wanting to engage in particular activities. We must also remember that under the bill, the Minister is only permitted to make pandemic orders if satisfied that they are reasonably necessary to protect public health in consultation with the CHO. And I've already referred to several other important safeguards. There are some other amendments that have been circulated. And I might seek leave of the House to extend my time so I can cover off some of the points that people asked me to in summing up.
Leave granted.
I'm happy to provide leave for the Minister to keep going for a few minutes, if that's helpful, but I'm also not happy, President, for her to attack the opposition in that process.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, he's entitled for his comments, please, members. And I don't think the Minister was attacking the opposition, but anyway, leave granted. Minister, to continue.
Thank you, President. I won't take much time. It's just that there was certain things that people wanted me to cover off. And obviously we can come back to this in detail in the committee stage of the bill on Thursday. But some members had some specific questions around the VCAT detention review response or the proposals that some had sought for this to be added. I would like to say that the detention powers have been a particular point of consideration, both when we extended the state of emergency in March and also in the development of this bill. As part of that consideration, which has been given to whether VCAT-based review options is achievable and or desirable, a core principle that we have maintained is that it is critically important to a person in detention that their review is heard and determined quickly. A review to VCAT was explored in detail, and following this consideration it was determined that VCAT would not be able to achieve the timeliness required to hear and determine detention cases effectively. It is important to note that the public health risk has to be considered as an aggregate sense, and this is the fundamental job of the CHO. Replicating this approach to risk assessment would be difficult within the VCAT model. A detention review officer the detention review officer arrangements that were developed and put in place with the March state of emergency extension provide a person-centred, accessible option with variations to detention that are currently made by the CHO, meaning that any risk to public health is appropriately considered by a public health expert with the most up-to-date public health information available. Important to note that I don't think many people are aware of this, but detention review officers are dedicated public servants. They are highly skilled senior barristers with a minimum of 10 years' experience to fulfil that role. So it's important to note the right of review has been thoroughly considered. And there is also the addition of Supreme Court review of detention orders if appropriate. I do want to emphasise that the bill sets the standard for transparency and accountability in Australia. No other Australian state or territory equivalent acts require emergency or public health orders to be published and tabled in Parliament. The bill has some of the most far-reaching accountability and transparency measures of any bill of this nature, and I'm happy to go through this in more detail, but for the brevity for this evening, I will draw the attention to just a few. The SARC committee can review pandemic orders and report to Parliament if, of the view, the orders are incompatible with human rights or they appear to have improper legal authority. SARC can recommend that an order be disallowed and both houses of Parliament can pass a resolution to disallow the order. The bill also requires for the establishment of an independent pandemic management advisory committee comprising people with relevant expertise representing different community sectors, which will provide advice to the Minister for Health in relation to making orders, including impacts on the community and business, for instance. The committee's report reports and recommendations will also be tabled in Parliament within 4 days, subject to amendments of being received by the Minister. The Government has also committed to providing appropriate resourcing for the function of the Independent Pandemic Management Advisory Committee. We've also committed to publishing a range of other material. The bill provides that the Secretary must make and publish a compliance and enforcement policy in relation to COVID-19 pandemic within 90 days of the pandemic declaration being made. Government has committed to including in this policy that any restrictions on protest rights should be limited to what is reasonably necessary to protect public health and should remain in force only for as long as is reasonably necessary. As well, there are detention guidelines covering the welfare of detained persons. Government has committed to address in the detention guidelines reference to access to fresh air and exercise, as well as medical care and access to necessary essentials such as food. President, I might finish there. The bill, in summary, has been, I don't need to summarise too much, it's been covered extensively in the debate today. This is about Victoria being able to continue its effective management of the COVID-19 pandemic after the state of emergency expiry. At the same time, we want to ensure Victoria has fit-for-purpose legislation to implement crucial public health measures in the event of future pandemics. And I would commend the bill to the House and thank members for their contributions today.
Thank you. The question is, there is an amendment moved by Mr. Bowman be agreed to. Those that opinion say aye. And the contrary, no. Believe noes have it. Division call. Ring the bell, please. you. Lock the doors. Question was the reason amendment moved by Mr. Bowman be agreed to. Members voting for the ayes, please stand in your place. Thank you, members. Members voting against, please stand in your place, and I indicate my vote was a nose. Thank you, members. And members, please do not leave the chamber. Question: the result of the division: ayes 18, noes 19. Therefore, the reason amendment is lost. Question: is the bill be read a second time? Those opinions say aye. Aye. In the contrary, no. No. The ayes have it. Division call. Ring the bell for 1 minute, please. Thank you. Lock the doors, please. Members, the question was the bill be read the second time. Members voting with the ayes, please stand in your place, and I'll indicate my vote with the ayes. Thank you. Members voting against, please stand in your place. Thank you, members. Result of the division: ayes 19, noes 18. Therefore, the second reading is passed. Mr. Davis.
President, I move that debate on this bill be adjourned for 7 days until 1. The Minister for Health answers questions raised by the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations
Order,
Committee.
order, Mr. Davis.
Sorry. Yes. Until the sorry. Yes. I'm going to do that too. Be adjourned 7 days.
We got it right.
The debate on the bill be adjourned until the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee has examined the bill further and received answers from the Minister for Health that were raised in Alert Digest number 15.
Does he need to move? I think Mr. Davis' word should be the bill be referred to SARS and report back. Are you happy with that? Okay. So can you please?
That the bill be referred to SARC to report back within 7 days.
Thank you. You don't need leave. Thank you. Order. A motion moved by Mr. Davis be agreed to. Motion is that Mr. Davis. Oh, you want to speak to it?
Doesn't have to be leave. SARC is...
Order. Ms. Pulford on the point 4.
Be put.
Okay.
Yes, you can.
Oh, hang on. According to standing orders, I can interrupt Mr. Davis, so I have to put the question. Thank you. Minister.
You need 6 to stand in our place.
Going to standing order 12. Thank you, members. Order 12.25. Member has sought to move for the closure of debate. Standing Order 12.25.2 requires that 6 other members must rise in their place to support the motion. I ask those members who wish to do so to now rise in their places to indicate their support. Thank you. There being at least 6 members who support the closure motion, I will put the question forthwith without amendment or debate. The question is that the question be now put. Those who set the opinion say aye. Aye. And the contrary, no? No. I believe the ayes have it. No. Division call? Yes. Ring the bell, please. Yeah. Thank you. Lock the doors, please. Members supporting the closer motion, please stand in your place, and I indicate my vote with the ayes. Thank you, members. Members voting against, please stand in your place. Thank you. Members, the result of the division, ayes 19, noes 18. Therefore, the ayes have it. And I put the question now. Mr. Davis has moved a motion. Motion moved by Mr. Davis be agreed to. Those opinion say aye. Aye. And the contrary, no? Aye. Noes have it, I believe. Division call, what for 1 minute, please. Thank you. Lock the doors. Members supporting Mr. Davis' motion, please stand in your place. Thank you, members. Members voting against the motion, please stand in your place and indicate my vote with a nose. Thank you, members. Result of the division, ayes 18, noes 19. Therefore, the noes have it and the motion is lost. Minister.
I move that the bill be committed on the next day of meeting.
Question is the bill be committed on the next day of meetings. Those opinion say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Division Court. Ring the bell for 1 minute, please. Thank you. Lock the doors, please. Question was the bill be committed next day of the meeting. Those members supporting the motion, please stand in your place and I indicate my vote with the ayes. Thank you, members. Members voting against, please stand in your place. Thank you, members. Members, the result of the division, ayes 19, noes 18. Therefore, the ayes have it. Minister.
I move that the House now to adjourn.
Thank you. Thank you, members. Can you leave quietly, please? Thank you. Mr. Rondaci.
Thank you, President. Good evening. My adjournment tonight is for the Minister for Planning. Residents do not approve of the proposed quarry on the Northern Highway affecting the beautiful townships of Beveridge and Wallen. Or as better said, a quarry in Beveridge and Wallen is the pits. The proposed structure plan for Beveridge North West Precinct has not gone down well with the residents of Wallen and Beveridge. A quarry in a high growth area that has many new families that are building their new homes and raising their families is a very bad idea. There was a community information session held in September 2021, which was attended over 100 concerned community members who did not want it. The Mitchell Shoal Council has twice rejected the planning permit, and residents have told me they don't want the dust, the noise, the extra traffic and the impact it'll have on their community. The action I seek from the Minister is to listen to the residents of Beveridge and Wallen and halt the government support for the quarry at the Wallen and Beveridge location.
Mr. Greenley.
Thank you. Thanks, President. My adjournment debate is for the Minister for Corrections in the other place. I recently met with the Minister to discuss a number of things, and one of those was the current status of programs within our prisons. It is something I've frequently spoken about in this place. Most prisoners will leave